All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here today. This is our first seminar of the academic year, so we're excited to start the tradition again. So thank you for being here. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the research program manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, and I will be your host for this event. This is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. Folks online, thank you so much for being here. Just a quick reminder, if it's been a little while since you've been at our seminar, your cameras, mics, and screen shares have been disabled, but we ask that you put any questions you might have for us or our speaker into the chat. Our volunteer, Roseanne, will help us by reading out those questions at the end of today's talk so that our speaker can hear those questions. All of you can hear them in the room as well. Because this is a hybrid event, just a reminder for folks in the room, when you have questions at the end of today's talk, raise your hand and we'll run around with a mic and you can ask your question using the mic so folks online can hear as well. And again, thank you so much for being here. For students that might be in the room, we have the very first class day today as well. The procedure for that is going to be a little different than in years past. There is a sign-up sheet out on the front table when you were coming in. Typically, we sign up there to justify us getting coffee and cookies, but there's another sign-in sheet specifically for students to document your attendance. So please make sure if you didn't sign up on that sheet on your way in, that you sign up on that sheet on the way out, and then every time you attend, make sure you sign up so that we can send that over to the school and recognize your attendance here. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. Today's speaker is also going to be doing our Science on Tap next week. So that's our first Science on Tap in a little while. So on Wednesday, October 2nd, Luke Rendell is going to be giving a talk that has a great title, and I don't want to mess it up. So glasses go on. Are you really about to talk to whales? And so that should be really fun and fascinating. So I hope you come on back October 2nd at 6 p.m. right here. I also have a little plea to ask anybody in the room and anybody online. I found out about a half an hour ago that next week's seminar speaker is unable to join us due to a family emergency. So if anybody has anything they want to practice or they want to share with us, even if it's not quite together, I'm looking for a really last minute seminar speaker. So if anybody wants to, please let me know, and we'll get you slotted and you can come and join us next week. So let me know if that's going to happen. We also typically record our seminars and we put it on our homepage. If you go to our events page and you scroll down, you'll find a list of all of our seminars. This particular seminar might have a slight delay in being posted, but it will be posted at some point. So if you are interested in sharing this with others, please check on that location and eventually we'll get that up for you. The other thing I wanted to just recognize about today's speaker is Luke is our this year's HMSC Lavern Weber Visiting Scientist. This fellowship endowment honors Dr. Lavern Weber, who was the director of HMSC from 1977 to 2002. The endowment provides support for visiting scientists and allowing them to spend time in residence here at HMSC and really advances our collaboration culture, which was fostered by Dr. Lavern Weber and we still take advantage of today. Visiting scientists bring expertise in diverse disciplines and lay the foundation for professional collaborations across universities and agencies. Fellows become part of our community. So I'm so excited to have our Lavern Weber visiting scientist here with us today. This particular individual has been sponsored by Mauricio Cantor and Kate Statford. And so I'm going to let Mauricio introduce today's speaker.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to introduce you Dr. Luke Rendell. He's a reader in biology at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and he's a scientist whose research spans a broad range of topics from animal behavior and cognition and cultural evolution. He's also a long-term mentor of mine and a good friend, and he's here today thanks to the Lavern Weber Visiting Scholar Program. So Dr. Rendell's work has been groundbreaking in many fields. For one, he's one of the first to propose the existence of culture in whales and dolphins, which was a controversial idea back in the early 2000s, but nowadays it blossomed into its own field in behavior studies. He uses today statistical models to assess social transmission in wild cetaceans, and this body work highlights how the species demonstrate complex communication and learning, drawing parallels with other species that are completely different, living in completely different environments, including us humans. So on his human behavior research, he also uses experimental approaches to explore how humans negotiate trade-offs involved in using social information to make decisions. He also employs evolutionary models to investigate the development of broader social behaviors, including cooperation and niche constructions. In addition to that, he's also a bioacoustician and leading research on vocal communication and assessing the impacts of human activities on marine mammals across various oceans. This has been possible because Luke is also an accomplished sailor, having led numerous expeditions in UK, in the Mediterranean, Caribbean, Galapagos, and the Eastern tropical Pacific. And I might risk saying that he might enjoy sailing as much, if not more, than studying whales in remote places. And in fact, this is how I met Luke for the first time. So sailing off Dominica and then later in the Galapagos, where we spent a good chunk of time eavesdropping on sperm whales. And yeah, much of my own work has been possible because of Luke's previous research. So his data, insights, and sailing skills made my own PhD possible. So I'm really grateful for that. Thank you very much. And let's not forget his cooking and singing skills as well. Because when you're yes, the science is incredible and all of that, but when you're sailing in remote places and living weeks on canned goods, you know, having a Shakira impersonator aboard is really the key to survival. And I hope he gets into that today. But yeah, with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Luke Rendell as he shares more of his exciting research on sperm whales with a great t-shirt to explain that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Is this mic okay? Is that volume okay for everybody? Thank you. Yeah, I haven't had enough alcohol today to do any Shakira, so that's gonna have to wait, unfortunately. But it was nice to have a reminder of the times that Mauricio and I have spent together. It's 10 years this year that we spent a lot of time during his PhD fieldwork in the Galapagos, and I will never forget the generosity with which he welcomed my eldest son here to join us for some of that fieldwork. I know how stressful PhD fieldwork is when it's your PhD fieldwork, and the idea that he would let some random kid come in and potentially mess it up was really very, very generous. And he has, definitely someone who distinguishes himself with kindness. That and also the gifting of this amazing shirt that I'm wearing is not my normal shirt, but it is really, it's an exploding whale shirt. And one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here on this Lavern Fellowship, Lavern Weber Fellowship, is to really visit the source of the exploding whale, the land of the exploding whale. But we've already had some great conversations, myself, Mauricio, and Kate. And I've been listening to bowhead whales all morning, and I'm now got a new enthusiasm. So, but today I want to really share with you some of the more recent results we've had from our studies of sperm whales in different places in the world. Some of you might recognize some of this work for if you went to Taylor Hirsch's seminar back in July, was it? Earlier this year, because we also work together quite a lot. So I'm going to start out by, we all know science is a team thing. So these are people who you will see at different places during the talk, but they're all people that I've worked with, and we're one sort of big team trying to figure out various things about sperm whales. And I'm grateful to the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada and to National Geographic for funding that has supported some of this work. So before I share what we have been finding, just have a little bit of background. You know, if you know anything about sperm whales, the image you probably have of them, as well as being slightly weird shaped, is of deep ocean nomads, right? They inhabit the deep ocean, and they are known for moving not in a sort of particularly strict migratory regular way, but in roaming the oceans readily, the deep oceans, right, where there are no barriers. So this is a paper just illustrating from the days of whaling, the discovery tag system, where metal cylinders were fired into whales, and then later on, when those whales were caught and rendered, then the tags would be recovered. And it demonstrates multiple movements in excess of 1,000 kilometers by female sperm whales in the North Pacific. This is mirrored by our own work on photo identification in the Eastern Tropical Pacific, showing the numbers. Where's my little? Oh, well, you can see the not bold numbers show how many re-sites there were between these very diverse sites, Baja California down to northern Chile, you know, movements of several thousand kilometers. And you get the same thing in the Atlantic. So this was a quite more recent report of an animal that had been seen 10 years apart off the Azores Islands in the North Atlantic, and then off the Bahamas some 3,000 miles away. So sperm whales have this really well-earned reputation for being ocean nomads. But I'm going to go on to argue that actually there's more to them than that, and I'll show you why. So an interesting thing about sperm whales is that they make these little patterns of clicks called codas, which is thought to be the basis of their social communication system. And I've spent a lot of my career recording these sounds and measuring them from different parts of the world. And the interesting thing is, if you go to different parts of the world, the sperm whales make different sounds. So if you're in the Mediterranean, you might hear a pattern of clicks like this. So two things to notice. First of all is the repetition and the stereotypy of that pattern, okay? And the second is the pattern itself, 1, 2, 3, 1, right? Imaginatively named the 3+1 type. And somewhere in my mind, there's a movie plot where the climax hinges on the fact that the hero, who's a marine biologist, recognizes that they're in the Mediterranean because they've heard that, they hear that coda. It's quite a convoluted plot, but you know, I'm getting there. But if you go to, say, the Eastern Caribbean, again, stereotyped and repeated, but you see the different pattern there. That's a da-da-da-da-da, 1 + 1 + 3 clicks of the Galapagos Islands. Okay, that's a pattern we call the 6 regular. We're not particularly florid with the naming of these, but we do have one from the South Atlantic off Brazil. So kind of true to the stereotype, it's quite a complex rhythm, being from Brazil, and the only name we could come up with was Brazilian. So we'll go with that, right? However, more interestingly than that, you know, initially you think, okay, well, this is just different animals in different places making different sounds. But if you spend a bunch of time in any one place, what you begin to understand is that different social units of sperm whales actually have different patterns of clicks. So in the Galapagos Islands, we've recorded this 6 regular, but we also hear this type. Okay, so that's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. Slightly more difficult to hear because there were echolocating sperm whales in the background there, just doing their foraging, but there it was. And then also what we, again, for want of a better word, just call the short clan. I'll just make these. So you get the idea. They are repeated stereotype patterns of clicks. And during my PhD, was one of the main findings of my PhD was that in all the social units that we knew around the Galapagos Islands from the 1980s and 1990s had one of these three coda types as their principal kind of dialect, right? And I showed that in the different colors on this map here represent those three different vocal dialects, and each dot is like a day where we encountered a group which had that dialect. So we showed that in one area around the Galapagos Islands, sympatrically, you had these different dialect groups using that habitat. So it's not just a geographic thing, right? It's a social vocal dialect. And what we also showed was that when these sperm whales live in, female sperm whales live in long-term social units of around a dozen animals, but they regularly associate, the units regularly associate together to form larger groups that are more temporary entities. They might last 10 days or so, but they only ever do it with other units that share the same dialect as themselves, right? So we identified this kind of higher order social structure based on vocal dialect that wasn't geographic, although it does have a geographic component, but you could get these different dialect groups existing sympatrically. And we termed these sort of higher order entities vocal clans. So vocal clans are collections of social units that share a vocal dialect and will potentially interact and associate with each other for short periods of time. And continuing our research theme in the Pacific, Taylor sort of took hold of this research and then developed it amazingly using and was part of a project that brought together recordings from the entire Pacific. And she did an enormous amount of work marking up and analyzing all these codas. And we found that across the entire Pacific Ocean, we found evidence for 7 of these vocal clans. So all the sperm whales in the Pacific Ocean belong to one of these 7 vocal dialect groups. And they have different geographic ranges. So in particular, this red, the one that's marked in red that's called short, was heard across the entire Pacific Ocean. Very common. But others have more restricted geographic ranges. So there's a complex patchwork of overlapping ranges with these vocal clans, right? And the scales here are enormous, right? That's a 3,000 kilometer scale bar, and you've got sperm whales that are swimming off Japan and sperm whales that are swimming off South America that share the same vocal dialect and could potentially recognize each other and interact if they were ever to meet. And what Taylor showed is that for any sort of collection of codas that a sperm whale unit produces, there will be some that are what we call identity codas. So somewhere between 40 to 60% of the repertoire that the sperm whales produce will be one of these 2 or 3 very common types that serve to identify the clan membership, the vocal clan membership of that unit. And Taylor identified these across all of these 7 clans as codas that are used often by one clan. So perhaps 40 to 60% of their repertoire will be made up of this particular coda type, like the 6R or something like that, and rarely used by others. Okay, so they serve to really differentiate the different groups. And she got us into thinking about whether these could be thought of as a kind of symbolic marker, an arbitrary trait that reliably denotes cultural group membership. What do I say, cultural group membership? Well, all the evidence we have suggests that these dialects are learned behaviors, okay? That young sperm whales, when they are growing up in their sort of social unit, hear the codas that are produced by the adults around them, and that's the dialect they learn, and that's how they, and it persists with them for life. We've looked into the genetics, and it really doesn't work to think of it as a genetically inherited based on the patterns of variation we find between the clans. Okay. And the interesting thing is that if you looked at what Taylor did is looked across the Pacific and showed that the more 2 clans overlapped in their spatial range, the more different their identity codas were, right? So you can measure how similar codas are in various ways. And so this is exactly what you would expect if these were signals that were designed or selected to differentiate between social groups or cultural groups. The more those cultural groups are in contact, then the more pressure there is for those calls to diverge and become more different. So that it's easier for these groups to rapidly signal and identify who's in their clan and who isn't, right? So that was a really interesting finding. And you don't see the same relationship if you look at coders which are not identified as these identity coders that are really key in signaling clan membership. So that's where we get this idea of the coder dialects being some kind of symbolic marker of group membership. So that's all fine. Big scale, thousands of kilometers. In fact, data from the Pacific has led to an estimate of the average sperm whale home range in the Pacific being about 1,000 kilometers across, right? So this all fits in with the idea of the ocean nomad. But what I'm going to do is take you to two places, the Caribbean, and specifically the Eastern Caribbean and the Western Mediterranean, and show that actually there are processes operating on much finer scales, but also involving these dialect groups and involving how sperm whales divide up their habitat amongst themselves, both in terms of their social groups and their cultural groups, but also their age sex classes as well. So we'll start with the Caribbean. This is just to situate you, okay? The Windward Islands and the Leeward Islands. It's been a source of unending pleasure in my career to be able to do research in places which are really nice to sail in as well. And it is. And since 2005, there have been researchers, including myself, working off the island of Dominica here, particularly there because in this part of the world, you have easterly trade winds blowing sort of in this direction, okay? And Dominica is a tall island, so you get a lovely little sheltered lee behind it in which you can have relatively sheltered water in which to work with these sperm whales. And Shane Guerreau has led the Dominica Sperm Whale Project since 2005 and has recorded dialects, the coder production of the social units that he's identified off Dominica. And in 2016, he published a paper showing that actually, just like in the Galapagos, when you spend a lot of time in a place, you figure out there's more than one, just one clan there. And so he identified two different dialect groups that were using the waters off Dominica. The first one you've already heard. That's the 1 + 1 + 3. Okay. So this is the one that our hero marine biologists will use to identify that they've been kidnapped and taken to the Caribbean instead of the Mediterranean, because it's very diagnostic of that group. But if I'm just going to turn the volume for the next one because it's kind of quiet. That's what we call the EC1 clan. And then there's a second clan that makes these kind of slow regular coders, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that you're hearing there, okay? And again, not winning any prizes for literary descriptions, but we call that the EC2 clan. And the interesting thing about off Dominica was that one was clearly much more common than the other, right? In fact, in almost 20 years of research, there are only 4 days in which this second clan has been identified in these waters, right? So it's present, but what we thought was it's kind of rare, right? And so having learned about this from the waters of Dominica, we wanted to find out, this is a fairly restricted research area, only 100 kilometers long. And we have these two clans that are never seen, almost never seen, well, they're never seen together and they're almost never seen on the same day. And what we wanted to find out, I mentioned Meredith Sackett here because she is responsible for these amazing little cartoon representations, a science communicator. If you need any diagrams done, look her up, she's really good. And I supervised her MSc thesis, so she owed me. But I paid her for this. So our question was, how do these clans interact in the wider region, right? That research area off Dominica is 100 kilometers long. We know from the Pacific that they can range over thousands of kilometers. So what's going on in the bigger picture, the bigger area? So we ran some surveys using an expanded research area up and down this island chain to understand how these clans were interacting over the region. Again, just to remind you, this is a 1,000 kilometer circle, the sort of ostensible home range of Pacific sperm whales centered on Dominica, right? So we expected these animals to be moving up and down this chain quite readily. And again, based on our findings in Dominica, we expected to find these clans evenly distributed across the chain. Okay, maybe we'd see more of the EC1 because they're more common in Dominica, and there might be fewer of EC2, but because of what we knew of the ranging behavior in the Pacific, we expected them to be moving up and down this chain quite readily. Okay, so we took Hal Whitehead's sailboat and we sailed up and down these islands, and that was great fun. This is what it's like.
Okay. Second vlog of the day. It's just a little excursion forward.
We find out why it's a good idea to study
bit of sailing
whales off
this
Dominica because it's deltaed waters, right? And when the trade winds are blowing, then you get these kind of conditions.
impressive.
But we were towing a hydrophone, and when we heard sperm whales, we only had to listen for hours. Enough data to because we've done the homework in Dominica in the sheltered waters, we were able to go to these more exposed waters and actually collect usable data. We didn't have to follow the whales around for very long. We just had to stick with it, okay? This introduced some interesting living conditions. So here's Taylor starring in our little vignette.
It's day 7. It is the day of leaning. What's going on, Taylor? Where are we?
We are close to Montserrat. We spent about 12 hours last night getting from where we had dinner back to where we had dinner. So we're just trying to figure out what to do today.
Yeah.
Given that we like to be on this inshore transect, we've had to put in some pretty aggressive tacks.
What has gone wrong with the stove?
So this is to give you some insight into, we do this for 2 weeks at a time. This is what the living conditions were like. And what we found actually really surprised us, right? First of all, we found a whole bunch more of new whales that we'd never identified before, okay? So we assumed that the whole population would be moving up and down through Dominica and we'd just catch them while we were there. And over 10 years, we would have accumulated pretty much all the population that was using those waters. Not the case. We found over 145 new individuals off a previous catalogue that was just over 200. And while about 20 social units had been identified around Dominica, during our surveys, we identified even more than that in terms of new social units that we hadn't seen before, right? So suddenly there are a bunch of whales that we'd never seen before, just by moving a few tens of kilometers up and down the island chain. And even more interesting was our expectations of the distribution of the clans were completely violated. We found a very clear pattern that was repeated in both years that we conducted surveys, where this EC1 clan in sort of teal there was found off islands in the north of the chain, St. Kitts, Guadeloupe, and Dominica, and in Grenada in the south, off Grenada in the south. But then in between, there was an area where we never saw those whales, and we only ever saw whales from the EC2 clan, okay? And that specifically was the islands of St. Vincent and St. Lucia, right? No, that's, am I right? Grenada, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, that's right. Oh no, that's Grenada down there, that's St. Vincent, that's St. Lucia, and that's Martinique. Got it right. And if you look at the scales here, right, that scale bar, you get just in the space of 25 kilometers, you switch from waters where you only ever hear one clan to waters where you only ever hear the other, right? So suddenly they're segregating their habitat on really quite, for a sperm whale, shockingly small scales. And we were also able to estimate their movement parameters using sort of photo ID recaptures during this period. So on this graph, on the y-axis is the time lag in days, and it's a log scale, right? So you go from 1 up to 365 or 1 year at the end. And then on the y-axis is the displacement, or the root mean square displacement in terms of the movement of the animals over that period. And if you look at 365 days on the black line, that's the data from the Eastern Tropical Pacific. That gets you to about 1,000 kilometers. That's where that estimate of 1,000 kilometers of a home range comes from, right? Those data. If you look at the same data, the same analysis done on data from the Eastern Caribbean, by the time you get to 1 year, it's barely touching 100 kilometers. So over 1 year, you've got an order of magnitude difference in the displacement of animals in these two different parts of the world. So that's why in my title, I talked about diversity of habitat use between the Caribbean and the Pacific. It seems we get very different patterns. Also, interestingly, is we looked at a bunch of different habitat measures for these different islands up and down the chain, because we hypothesized maybe there's something particularly special about those islands, and one clan kind of monopolizes them and excludes the other for some reason. And in red are the islands that are used a lot by the EC2 clan, and in teal, the ones used by the EC1. And basically, on whatever measures you look at, whether it's the type of habitat or the current or the chlorophyll, the islands are not particularly different, right? They don't stand out as being particularly different, which leads us to our working hypothesis is that this pattern of usage of the different islands by the different clans is traditional, just like the dialects themselves, that it's something that the sperm whales acquire. This is our habitat. These are the islands we use, and the other clan uses the other islands. So if you know anything about my research and my publications and what Mauricio indicated further, you won't be surprised to know that, you know, I'm out here arguing that this is because the cultural transmission of behavior in sperm whale societies allows them this degree of flexibility, right? To live as ocean nomads where it's appropriate in the Pacific, and also where it might serve them differently to use these clan dialects to divide habitat over very small scales and become specialists on individual islands. Okay. So that's the Caribbean. Now we're going to go to the Mediterranean, where I've been. I started a sperm whale research project there in 2003 that is ongoing, and has developed from me showing up with my rucksack in 2003, getting a lecture from the taxi driver from the airport about how there were no sperm whales around the Balearic Islands, and I was wasting my time completely, to what is now a local NGO that has taken on this project with my colleagues Chema Brotons and Marga Serda, and also Enrico Pirotto, who I think a few of you will know because he's been here a few times. It's a sort of labor of love for him. We don't pay him anything, but he's just really into it and he helps us out a lot. What's really cool about this is we've gone from a situation where, you know, I was getting grief from the taxi driver about wasting my time, through to one where the local newspapers are now running sort of front page stories about the sperm whales that live around these islands. So in terms of raising awareness, you know, that's really cool. And just to give you a sense of how these animals are moving, this is to situate you. Spain, France, Italy, and the Balearic Islands are this little group here. And the dots there are identifications that we've made. And then the dots near Italy and France are identifications that other colleagues have made. And we did a project showing that these animals were moving over ranges of about 500 kilometers, you know, over this Western Mediterranean basin. Well, that's great. That's what we would expect based on, you know, sperm whale movements. And then when we look more closely at what this map shows, in black all the survey effort, and then in red and yellow the encounters that we've had with sperm whales. And one thing we immediately figured out here was that we were encountering sperm whales in slightly different ways than we had in other places, in that we would encounter sometimes groups of animals, just like we would in the Caribbean or the Pacific, but we would also encounter what we term singletons, right, which were just individual sperm whales swimming around by themselves. And these are almost exclusively males swimming around by themselves. So we have an area of the ocean where both female groups and individual males are using the same piece of ocean. And this is not like what happens in the bigger oceans, where there's a latitudinal gradient where female groups tend to stay in the tropics and then males leave their natal groups and become solitary and then head towards the poles where they get they acquire a large size, which apparently is a big deal for sperm whales to be big, male sperm whales anyway, in terms of their mating success. So we had this really strange situation where and groups of females using the same piece of ocean. And these data, so this is just a little aside about a conservation win, which is the introduction or the augmentation of an existing national park around the Cabrera archipelago in the south of Mallorca there to protect almost 90,000 hectares of deep ocean habitat, right? One of the only deep ocean protected areas in Europe. And it was based on our data showing a really high encounter rate of sperm whales down in that part. So it's taken 20 years. If you're working in conservation, you have to look at these timescales, right? It's taken 20 years to establish this degree of protection, but it's not going away now. It's a federal government, Spanish equivalent of federal government reserve. So it's a really nice outcome for sort of 20 years of effort. And it's pretty small relative to the sperm whale habitats, but it's better than nothing. And they need protection because there's, for example, a lot of shipping going around there. This just shows how heavily used these waters are. And there's our little protected area by Cabrera there. And the future, this population is endangered. It's only numbers of a few thousand animals. So conservation is a big part of what we're trying to do there. But we also have a really nice story about how these animals themselves are dividing up this habitat, right, between the females and the singleton males. And this was work led by Enrico, where he looked at stable isotopes, carbon and nitrogen, to get some idea of how these different age sex classes were using the same piece of water. And so this plot here shows the animals that were biopsy sampled in terms of their nitrogen 15 and carbon 13 levels. In red, you've got males, genetically sexed, and in green, you've got females. So one thing is to note that in general, they're very well separated, right? It looks like from this data that the males and females are eating different, or in different places on the food chain or in the food web. There is one animal that was male that clustered with the females there. You can see that one. We thought this animal was female when we sampled it because it was part of a group. Turns out it was a male that had not yet got old enough to leave its group, so it was still following the females around and either having milk from its mother, or which would have the same profile, or just feeding in the same ways that its mother was. So that just goes to show that once these males had left their group, they were switching the resource that they were concentrating on. So the males had higher 15N levels, which would indicate that they're feeding at a higher trophic level than the females. But their prey are squid. And an interesting thing about squid is that you get multiple trophic levels within the same species, right? Because big squid eat little squid and they're not too fussed about which squid species they're eating. So cannibalism is a thing in deep sea squid. So you can have multiple trophic levels within the same species. So they can be eating the same species, but be feeding at different trophic levels by targeting different sizes. It also seems like, although the difference in delta 13 between the two was small compared to the analytic precision of the procedures we were using, it's still the case that there's much more variation between the sexes than there is between within them. which suggests that maybe the males are targeting slightly further offshore resources as well. And Enrico picked this up in some of his habitat models too, showing that the singleton males are more likely to be a bit further offshore. So you get from here the idea that, okay, they're able to, even though they're in the same bit of water, they're able to divide the resources ecologically by targeting slightly different resources in the same area. And somehow we don't understand the mechanisms behind it, but presumably the outcome is that it deconflicts these two age sex classes from competing with each other. The other interesting thing is that since 2019, we've expanded our research area up to the northeast of the archipelago. That's where you see there, northeast of Menorca, which is the easternmost island, all those survey tracks that we've done in the last sort of 3 to 4 years. And that's produced a very interesting set of results. If we look at the sightings of sperm whales that we've had over that period, and we mark them differently based on whether they're a singleton male, a group of females, or a group of females with a calf, okay, we see some very clear patterns. There's precisely one red dot above 40 degrees north, and that's very much an exception. So what we see is this kind of latitudinal change, distribution of age sex classes, where as you go north of 40 degrees, you're much more likely, if you encounter sperm whales, to encounter a group of females rather than a singleton male. All the singleton males appear to be south of 40 degrees north. And also, as you go further north, you're much more likely, if you encounter sperm whales, to encounter a group that has a calf as well, okay? So again, if you look at the scales here, that's a 500-kilometer scale bar. So they're dividing out this habitat somehow on those kind of scales. And it also highlights how unusual the Balearics are as a place where you get these singleton males and these groups of females at the same time. Why is this happening? Well, our working theory is that actually these groups that you see are coming down to the Balearic Islands and dropping off their juvenile males, right? Everyone knows what a pain in the ass an adolescent male can be sometimes. And it's no different for sperm whales. And in our photo ID records, we have, over the years, we've got 8 records of individual animals that have been seen in the context of both a group and alone, right? And for all 8 of those, they were seen first in a group and then as a singleton. So our working hypotheses are these are males that have been ejected from their group, right, and left down in the Balearics so that the female groups can then go further north and have more calves. Why? Well, one of the nice advances in the last few years has been this ability to use drones to get a perspective on these animals' behavior that we've never had before. In this video, you're going to see over here 2 larger animals, which you'll have to take my word for it, but in the video preceding what I'm about to show you, it is graphically illustrated that these animals are male, right? And there's no such illustration for this smaller animal over to the left. So this is all in the context of a single group encounter. So they're all in the same group, 2 males, presumably juvenile, they haven't left yet, and 1 calf, which we assume is female and is smaller. And if you watch what happens, so that's the 2 on the right, okay? So take my word for it, you know, that's several tons of animal ramming into you. That's potentially injurious, I think I'm saying that right, ramming by this sort of subadult male into a smaller calf, and it gets the other male very excited as well. So if you're a mother sperm whale and that's your calf and you see it getting rammed with that force by juvenile males in your group, then it's perhaps no surprise that you want to get those males out, right? Go do something else, go do what you have to do. So there's something that causes this separation to happen. And this is a species typical behavior. Males always leave their social units and go off and eventually become solitary. And this is how it sort of spans out from on a global scale, right, the mature male distribution is much wider in latitude terms than the females and their offspring, which are largely tropical. And then you have these areas where you get the males that have been ejected from their social groups, but are not yet big enough to be mature, socially and sexually mature, and searching for mating opportunities. In the Mediterranean here, in the Western Mediterranean, it seems that, you know, we know we have mature males seen off the coast of France and Italy, and also around the Balearic Islands. We know that there are female groups seen over almost the same latitudinal range as well. And then we have evidence that there's a kind of collection of these maturing males around the Balearic Islands. So the point here is that, well, important question marks that we haven't been able to survey. And this is, again, is the spatial scale. So compare that to the 1,000-kilometer home range. And so this is where the diversity of population structure from my title comes in. In the Mediterranean, where there's a much more confined piece of habitat, then sperm whales have adopted their sort of age-sex age-sex-based partitioning of habitat to adapt to this particular Western Mediterranean. Okay, and I just want to finish up with some ongoing research now, which hasn't been published but involves Taylor again. You've heard the 3+1 coda that is typical of the Mediterranean. This complicated technical plot is essentially about saying all the repertoires from the Balearics that we have indicated here are dominated, i.e. they have very dark squares where these 3+1 coda types occur, right? So they have repertoires which are dominated by that particular thing, right? So that's the Balearics, and there's also a population of sperm whales in the Eastern Mediterranean that occur along the Hellenic Trench. And so Taylor and I have been working with our colleagues Alexandros and Vula from that research group to do a comparison of the coda dialects in these two places. Okay, we initially thought it was going to be the same everywhere. The genetic data from the Mediterranean suggests that there were maybe just one or two female lineages that actually invaded the Mediterranean, and all the Mediterranean sperm whales are descended from those two lineages, okay, because we have very little evidence of transfer now, and all the sperm whales that have been sampled in the Mediterranean share the same mitochondrial DNA haplotype with maybe one or two SNPs that are different. So they're quite homogeneous. But here's a bunch of locations where we made recordings of codas, either us in the Balearics or our colleagues in Greece. And if we put this into this kind of illustration, where you've got at the top a dendrogram, which is just based on a quantitative measure of repertoire similarity between the different units. And then you've got a table below that where each row corresponds to a coda type. And you can see the sort of dot illustration of what that temporal pattern looks like on the right. And then where the cell in the table is shaded more darkly, it means that coda type made up more and more of its repertoire, okay? So the interesting thing in here is that on the left, that cluster is made up almost entirely of repertoires from the Balearics. On the right is exclusively repertoires that were recorded in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it turns out that in the Eastern Mediterranean, if you look at those blue dots, they have a different compressed 3+1 coda type, right? Da-da-da-da, instead of the slow da-da-da-da. The other interesting thing to note here is that there's an asymmetry in that many of the whales from Greece also make the slow 3+1 coda type. So you see the slightly gray shaded cells at the top here. But if you look at the row that corresponds to the fast 3+1, that is very common and very dark, and in the cells corresponding to the Eastern Mediterranean, they're almost never made in the West, okay? So an even more interesting anomaly is that there are actually 3 repertoires here that are recorded in Greece, but cluster with all the repertoires from the Balearics, because those animals also make some of the slow 3+1 coda types, right? So you have in the Western Mediterranean, repertoires dominated by this slow 3+1. In the Eastern Mediterranean, you have repertoires that are dominated by the fast 3+1, but also contain the slow 3+1. So I think you can see where I'm going here. The sperm whales would have come in through Gibraltar, okay, established themselves in the Western Mediterranean with their 3+1 codotype, and they've subsequently made their way, and a subgroup or a subpopulation of them have ended up in the Eastern Mediterranean, and through some quirk in the cultural evolution process, maybe a bottleneck or a founder effect, or perhaps more rapid evolution in a smaller population, they've adopted this fast 3+1. Okay, and just this year, there was a paper published through recordings of Sicily in the middle, showing that the repertoires there were mostly this slow 3+1, but you also got some of this fast 3+1. So maybe there's a meeting there in the middle. In general, this shallow water between Sicily and Africa is considered to be a barrier between the two basins. It's obviously the ocean, anything can swim through it, it's not perfect, but in general, you don't see evidence of transfer across that. So that's just showing how these processes can play out and how they're affected by different habitat structures. Society shows considerable flexibility within the species to adapt to local ecologies and to threats, to live as both nomads and as sort of dwellers situated in one particular place. And now that varies by across vocal dialect groups, what we understand as vocal clans, which have other behaviors that are culturally transmitted alongside the dialects. And also in terms of their age sex classes and how do they deconflict with their own offspring, for example. And then I'll just finish with a plug. This is Anna and a PhD student that I co-supervised, Aideen Omani, recovering a drone after a flight that took some of that footage. And Aideen will be here in 2 weeks' time giving this seminar about her work on the genetic structure of humpback populations in northern BC and the behavior there. So do come back in a couple of weeks and see what she's got to say. It'll be really interesting. And that's me. Thank you for your attention.
All right, everyone.
Use most of the slot, minimal questions.
There was a plan to that?
Yeah.
All right. So we'll take a couple questions and then we'll take a little pause for those folks that need to leave right on time. And then we'll take a couple more questions. So we'll start with any questions online and then we'll jump to the room. So go ahead, Roseanne.
Have you noticed any relationship between coda complexity and noise level pollution?
No, but I haven't really looked. But there are, as I've seen in those illustrations of the diversity, there are some coda types which are more complicated than others. But in the Pacific, the complicated and less complicated ones exist in the same place. And you know, both Taylor and I have looked at how these dialects change over time, and it turns out they're very, very stable, right? They hardly change at all over the periods of 10 to 15 years that we've got data for. So I don't think that the form of the codus is responding directly to proximate things like noise pollution, right? That's not to say it's not a serious problem for sperm whales, especially in the Mediterranean, where I was just there last month and actually frustratingly lost a group of sperm whales because it happened to be on a ferry route and just 3 or 4 ferries came through and I couldn't hear them anymore. Presumably they couldn't hear each other either. So I don't have any evidence that the codas are responding directly to noise, even though noise is a problem for sperm whales. I think the processes are much slower than that actually that causes this diversity of coda types to arise.
All right, question in the room.
Thanks, Luke. That was a really awesome talk. My first question, which I don't want you to answer right now, is why everybody who studies sperm whales likes sailing so much. But you can answer that later. Ever since Taylor's talk, I've been really interested in this concept of a clan, and I have a bunch of questions that I won't ask right now. But the first is it seems most compelling on this real small fine scale where they're, clearly segregating by vocal repertoires. And especially given that video you just showed, what's the motivation? Like, what do you think is the motivation for them to only associate with individuals that make the same, quotas that they do? If there's a clear advantage to being in a big group for, kicking killer whales' butts or whatever, like, do they engage in different hunting strategies, or what would the mechanism be that would make them want to not associate with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it boils down to the free rider problem in the evolution of cooperation, right? Where there's clearly something cooperative going on in terms of the defense against predators, but it's also the case that animals will alloparent. So lots of cases of calves being escorted at the surface by animals other than their mother, and sometimes nursed by animals other than their mother, because they're not capital breeders, they're income breeders. So the females have to dive to depth where they get their squid for all the time that they're lactating the calf, and the calf is then very vulnerable. And I think that vulnerability drives the evolution of sperm whale social structure. The free rider problem in the evolution of cooperation is, well, okay, you help out, you participate in a collective defense like that, right? And you protect everyone in your group. But what if you're, being subject to a cheater who comes into the group, but does none of their work, takes all the benefit, right? That's essentially the free rider problem in the evolution of cooperation. And I didn't really have time to go into here, but I said that there wasn't a direct genetic relationship between dialect and genes, such that genes, we don't think, cause the dialect. They don't have a causal thing to make one sperm whale make one coda and a different sperm whale make a different coda. But it is the case that, because it's a matrilineal social structure, the coda dialects tend to pass down the maternal line, right? So you learn them from your mother and your mother's sisters and things like that while you're growing up in the social unit. And so we find correlations between mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down the maternal line, and these dialects, right? Not perfect, not ones that could illustrate a genetic causation, but a correlation that builds up over time. So these vocal clan dialects are actually signals of some ancestral maternal relatedness, right? Which then kin selection is one way around the sort of free rider problem in cooperation. You're motivated to help individuals that you think you share, or you might share some kind of kinship with. That would be my explanation. Much of it is not substantiated by evidence, but
One second. So if anybody needs to leave, go ahead and do so at the back door on either side. And we'll just keep asking a few more questions as we kind of wrap up.
Is that relatedness between genetics and coda only true on really fine scales, or is it also true on like the Pacific Basin scale?
Well, the data comes from the Pacific that we did that, right? But I know when you get correlations between genetics and behavior, the tendency is to think, well, the genes are somehow causing the behavior directly. But all behavior really is all behavioral development is an amalgamation of experience and genetic inheritance and also perhaps social inheritance. And so when we look at the nuclear DNA, right, there's almost no relationship at all between clan membership and nuclear DNA, which suggests the males are mating, as you would expect males to do, with whoever they can. So the nuclear thing is it just breaks down. It's only in the maternal DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, that you see this statistical relationship, because they're correlated, because they're being passed down in the same route, right, from mother to offspring. That is on the Pacific scale. That's on a large scale. So these dialects are to some degree reflecting maternal genealogy, and therefore, if you hear the same dialect in another unit, evolution knows that you guys probably shared have some degree of sharing of maternally inherited genes as well. So maybe you should look out for each other.
All right, question online. Roseanne, go ahead.
Do different sympatric clans have different foraging strategies?
Yeah, good question. Yes, This is something I didn't have time to go into, but when we look at things like movement and foraging success between the different clans in the Pacific, we find quite a lot of variation that is explained by the clans, right? So in the Pacific, there's a phenomenon called the El Nino, which introduces catastrophic sort of marine ecological collapse around the Galapagos Islands in particular. And when we looked at the foraging success of the two different most common clans during that period, we found they had quite different responses. In non-Nino times, one clan did about twice as well in terms of its observed foraging success than the other. So seemed like it was beating the other one, and why wouldn't it all be just that one clan? But then in the Nino years, that reversed, right? And the clan that wasn't doing so well ended up doing better than the other one. So you had a kind of hare and tortoise dynamic where in non-Nino years, one clan was outcompeting the other, but then it switched in the other years. So we don't have direct causal evidence as to how that's happening. It's by inference, but they're having very different foraging success in different ecological conditions, which suggests that they do have different ways of different foraging strategies or different ways of using their habitat.
Okay, everybody, we're going to take one more question in the room, and then we're going to wrap up. But remember that Luke has some office hours if you want to follow up with him.
Yeah, I'm here for 2 weeks.
Right.
Afternoon's good.
All right, have more questions.
Thanks for the great talk, Luke. I'm still thinking about that video footage you just showed. Looked like I have two questions. Looks like you were pulling a hydrophone, and so I'm curious what the acoustics were like during that whole interaction. And then second question, from the drone footage, you should be able to get length measurements from each of the animals, and then potentially use that to get age estimates and demographic units. So I was wondering if you have a sense of who was in the group, because it looked like some animals kind of branched off and got closer together, and then some kind of went into attack mode. And then I was really surprised to see that the large male was being lazy and hanging out in the back. So I was wondering, I was hoping.
He's just there to deliver sperm. Like it's like the Amazon delivery, and then you've got no commitment, right, to what's going on there. Just go and find some other group to, if you guys get eaten, that's too bad, but there's plenty other sperm whales in the sea.
Well, I was curious who like if you have any sense of who was doing the attacking or who was doing the protecting.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm pretty sure that Anna is working on the length issue and that kind of thing. Obviously, we don't have samples to say whether they're male. We would expect that group to contain a mix of mature females, immature males. There was one mature male, and there's a few calves dotted in there that are really hard to see because they are surrounded by females, right, being heavily protected. And so we don't know. It could be the older females, the matriarchs. It could be the younger ones and the juvenile males who are just generally more bolshy. That's a really good question, and we don't know the answer. In terms of the acoustics, yes, I have had a student look at that, and the answer is completely nuts. It's all going off under the water. These animals are clicking like crazy, and they're just buzzing, and yeah, it's just actually impossible to tease apart what's going on. It's just an absolute cacophony. But yeah, they are shouting about what's going on. For sure. That encounter, you saw a few minutes of it. It actually went on for several hours. The killer whales made several attempts, different directions, to try and get in there and separate off. That's how they generally work, is they try and separate off one animal and then attack it together. And they never succeeded. It was always like that kind of outcome. Whatever sperm whales were close to them turned, faced them fairly aggressively, chased them off, and eventually the killer whales gave up and moved on. So that was like 1-0 to the sperm whales. I will say, Bob, I saw the other outcome in the Caribbean one time where we were following a group of sperm whales that went deadly silent and then found killer whales with big chunks of meat in their mouths and things like that. So yeah, it's a real battle.
All right, I'm not sure I want to end right there. But I will say that this is not the end of our interactions with Luke. And so I just encourage you to keep talking with him while he's here. Come back and we'll talk some more at our Science on Tap.
Yeah.
And for folks online, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out directly via email.